So good evening and welcome to the International Spy Museum. My name is Vince Houghton. I'm the museum's historian. Tonight's program is entitled Why Intelligence Fails, which is a topic that's always on the mind of anyone who studies intelligence for a living. Partly because the failures are somewhat easier to study than the successes. Since failures tend to be public and successes are kept secret in many cases, and for reasons varying from you want to maintain secrecy, you want to make sure tradecraft is maintained, you want to make sure methods and sources are maintained. Sometimes you get the killing of Osama bin Laden or you get a Stuxnet that comes out in public. But usually successes can be kept below the level of public consciousness. Not so much with failures. Failures tend to be public. Failures tend to be significant, even catastrophic in many cases. Difficult, if not impossible, to hide from public view. So we have an understandable tendency to try to deconstruct these failures, try to explain why they happen, try to get at the root of their causes. Why didn't we see Pearl Harbor coming? Why didn't we see the Tet Offensive happening? Why didn't we know the Yom Kippur War was about to begin? Why didn't we know 9/11 was about to happen? It's that final question that brings us here tonight. And the two men that are going to speak to you and to join us will try to shed some light on this extremely controversial topic. The first person to speak tonight will be Dr. Milo Jones. He's a visiting professor at the IE Business School in Madrid, where he teaches business strategy and geopolitics. He's also a consultant and merchant banker with Insight Advisory Partners. In the past, Milo has worked for Morgan Stanley Dean Witter in New York and for Accenture and Citibank Emerging Markets in London. He began his career serving 4 years as an officer in the United States Marine Corps. He holds a BA in art history from Northwestern University, an MBA from London Business School, and an MA with distinction and a PhD in international relations from the University of Kent in the United Kingdom. We have time to do anything else. He is currently a fellow of the Salzburg Global Seminar and a member of both the AFIO, the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Dr. Jones is the co-author of what you see here, Constructing Cassandra, Reframing Intelligence Failure at the CIA, 1947 to 2001, which was published in the fall of 2013. He has lived in Europe since 1996 and now lives with his wife and daughter in Warsaw, Poland. The second person to speak will be Dr. Mark Lowenthal, who is the president and CEO of the Intelligence and Security Academy, a national security education and consulting company. He has been the assistant director of Central Intelligence for Analysis and Production, CIA. Also the vice chairman on the National Intelligence Council, staff director for the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence for the 104th Congress, which was some time ago, we won't say how long, and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence. Now his book, which I read as a young grad student, not so young grad student, but a grad student nonetheless, Intelligence from Secrets to Policy, which is now in its 6th edition. The 6th edition comes out in 2 weeks. So we don't have it back there, but if you order it, we will ship it to you free of charge. And the 6th edition comes out, like I said, hot off the presses. And this book itself is really the standard both undergraduate and graduate school textbook on the subject of intelligence. And Dr. Lowenthal is also a Jeopardy grand champion. Little fun trivia there. So once both Dr. Jones and Dr. Lowenthal have spoken, we'll open up the discussion for questions from the audience. Before that begins, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Milo Jones.
Thank you, Vince. Thank you to the Spy Museum, where at some point, some of what you say does make an impression and work. And I know that keeps me going much of the time. So as I say, thank you for coming, and thank you for considering what I think is an important question, which is why does intelligence fail? And I have to preface my remarks with the clear statement that this book is not a gotcha-style attack on either the patriotic and hardworking men and women of the intelligence community generally and the CIA specifically, but it's also not intended to minimize how difficult the task intelligence agencies set themselves are. This is not a CIA bashing book. Those of you who know me well won't be particularly surprised by that, but I do tend to qualify my remarks before speaking because often when you say CIA, particularly in Europe, people shrink back in horror and ignorance, frankly. But that said, the book does intend to focus on mistakes, and does focus on mistakes. And it does so not to attack the CIA, but my real goal was to make mistakes informative again. Because, well, I'll get to why I say that mistakes are not always informative. So, we all know why the CIA was founded, and what, well, I'll talk first what the book's about. Why was the CIA founded? In 1947, America, let's put it this way, Pearl Harbor was as fresh in the minds of Americans in this town in 1947 as 9/11 was for everyone in this room about 6 or 7 years ago. It was a major shock to the system. And remember, by 1947, not only was Pearl Harbor still on the horizon, but nuclear weapons were also there. So there was a real need for an agency, for the government to organize to prevent another Pearl Harbor, as it was said. Now, by some measures, the CIA has succeeded magnificently in preventing another Pearl Harbor. As the joke goes, the Japanese Imperial Navy has stayed away from Hawaii ever since the CIA was founded. But I don't look at that fact. Instead, the book considers 4 major strategic surprises. And whether they're all surprises is somewhat contestable, I'll confess. But I look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, the fall of the Shah of Iran, the collapse of the USSR, and 9/11. These 4 surprises I chose because there's relatively large amounts of public information about them, in contrast to some other surprises that either are not as important or simply there's not enough declassified about them. So when you're a PhD student, you got to work on such matters, and this is a reworked PhD dissertation with the seams still showing. For those of you who actually read it, you'll see. And so those are the cases I worked on, and that's what the book considers. Now, when you begin a PhD on strategic surprise, you realize, well, there are a couple approaches to looking at and thinking about intelligence failures. First of all, there's what's called the warner versus warnee problem, that there are intelligence agencies, and they might know something's happening, and they might warn politicians or policymakers, and they might not be listened to. I don't consider problems like that. What interests me is when intelligence agencies themselves are surprised, because by definition, if they're surprised, you can't expect policymakers not to be surprised. What are some of the theories you find if you look into that? Well, first of all, there's a sort of blunder school that asserts no particular theory of how a strategic surprise happened. It just sort of is a catalog of mistakes, and you can draw your own conclusions. Those aren't very interesting. Then there's the political school. Political school, you might say, breaks down into they're the internal politics of an agency or a bureaucracy, or there's the external political pressure that allegedly made an intelligence producer assert one thing that turned out to be an error. So there are various political ways of coming at the question. Then there are related theories that go into organizational behavior, and they talk about silos of information and miscommunication across agencies, and they attempt to explain intelligence failures for those reasons. And those are somewhat satisfying, but what you find is, logically, if that's the case, then intelligence agencies organized different ways should sooner or later hit at an optimal design for an intelligence agency that prevents failures. And you don't find that. Indeed, you find cycles of centralization and decentralization after each surprise that doesn't seem to solve the problem of surprise. So I didn't find those very satisfying. And then, of course, there are psychological explanations where either it's down to people quite rightly explain the individual biases in psychological biases of analysts and so on. And those have some compelling points to them, but they don't quite fit so well with the other explanations I've talked about. And so I wanted to get at a theory that seemed to sum everything up. And the closest you come to that is what's known as the sort of cybernetic theory. And that was put forward by a woman named Roberta Wallstetter, who I'm pleased to say also published with Stanford University Press a long time ago. And her hypothesis was simply that strategic surprises or intelligence failures happen not because of a lack of information, but because of the way that information gets sifted or fails to be sifted. There's Roberta, and she published a book, Pearl Harbor Warning and Decision, in the 60s. For those of you who are PhD students, there is a nightmare scenario. When she turned in her dissertation, her advisor called her in the next day and said, Roberta, are there other copies of this? And she said, yes, there are 2. And he said, bring them to me. And she said, why? And he said, several people have read this and we've decided you don't have the clearance to possess it. This was America in the 50s. It took her about 5 years to fight the battle and be permitted to both possess her own PhD and publish it with some things. So when you look into her theories, which is that you use hypotheses to sort signals from noise in intelligence, you discover a phrase, and that phrase became beloved of the 9/11 Commission. And there, I forget which of the French poets said, every theory contains a fragment of autobiography. And in my case, that's very true. I worked in the World Trade Center, and I really didn't like the 9/11 Commission's conclusion, and I was particularly irritated by the phrase, failure of imagination, which comes from Roberta Wohlstetter. And people pinned 9/11 on a failure of imagination. Now, I recognize the virtues of that phrase, in particular, in Washington. The great thing about a failure of imagination is there's no one to blame. And it seems rather hard to fix. It struck me as the intellectual equivalent of shrugging your shoulders. And if it all comes down to, well, you need hypotheses to sort signals from noise, information from data, and hypotheses, gosh, our imagination just failed. The mistake is not informative. And I wanted to make the mistake informative again. So I tried to pursue, wait, if this is a failure of imagination, is there anyone out there who in fact imagined these intelligence failures and was somehow for some reason ignored? Because if they imagined them, then it's not a failure of imagination. It suggests that intelligence failures are in fact problems of the sociology of knowledge, to be pretentious about it. And that's what I pursued. So who's a Cassandra? Does anybody, well, so those of you who really know the Iliad well will remember Cassandra is a very good-looking daughter of King Priam. And like most good-looking women in Greek stories, she quickly gets propositioned by a Greek god, Apollo, who in an attempt to win her favors, promises her foresight, the gift of foresight. Well, Cassandra still doesn't cooperate with Apollo's wishes, and gods can't take back their presents. So he just makes sure she's not believed. So she spends the whole Iliad, as you see, seeing what's going to happen to poor Troy and not being believed. She's, if you will, the rogue analyst out there. But the point of Cassandra's is, if you can find them, then the problem is not a failure of imagination. I hope that much is clear. So how did I come at this problem? I said, well, look, if it's not a question of failure of imagination, and if you accept that you use hypotheses to sort signals from noise, what could influence hypotheses? And the theory of the book is the hypotheses, the permitted questions in an intelligence agencies, are functions of an identity, the identity and culture of the people doing the analysis. So I tried to think about and explore, well, what might be the identity and culture of the CIA over time, and what might be some of the constants of that culture, and how could you explain how those arose? To be completely honest, I first identified the 4 features, and then a PhD supervisor said, no, you got to go back. Take a year and explain why they exist. So the entire left-hand column represents a year of my life. But I basically say that if you're over time in relative terms, and please remember, the CIA is a subset of American society, and a lot of what I describe about the CIA was also true of America as a whole. But for purposes of brevity, I'll just quickly say that over time, the CIA has been relatively homogeneous. It's mostly been male, particularly in the past, and it's mostly been Caucasian male. And that, I believe, has important consequences for analysis that I trace. It's prone to scientism. And what I mean there is a particular fetishization, to use an academic term, but a fixation on at least the form of science, if not the substance of science. Because there's an element of sort of 50s positivism about how intelligence is done in the United States, which turns out we've known since the mid-60s that that's a rather naive view of how real science happens. But nevertheless, the intelligence community, and the Pentagon's equally guilty of this, they're prone to a particular naive, crude view of how science is done. Then, of course, secrecy, right? It's a secret intelligence agency, and so the secrecy is part of the culture. And then, of course, it's like all bureaucracies, it's prone to consensus. And you see that on corporate boards, and you particularly see it at the CIA because, of course, it is the central intelligence agency. It was designed to centralize intelligence, create a consistent, and create a corporate product. So none of these are faults of the agency, they're just features that I believe help explain why some things surprised America and some things didn't. Now, if you want to know how those get created, I would suggest that quickly, there's a layer of self-selection. A certain type of person joins the CIA, tries to join the CIA. Then there's the layer of active selection. The CIA says, yes, you can come in. No, you can't. That selects for another type of person. Then there's what goes on when you're there. And as you see, there's long subsets of things that happen that, like any place where you work, socialize you to the environment. There's a way things are done around here. And then finally, there's mirror imaging. And for those of you who are familiar with the term mirror imaging in intelligence work, it usually means that the analyst begins to reflect the view of the intelligence target. But in a particularly American twist, I believe one of the big problems with American intelligence is we tend to mirror image the so-called intelligence customer. The whole idea that the CIA is an intelligence producer and it has political and policy-making customers leads to an unconscious mirror imaging of the ignorance and unasked questions of the consumer. In American culture, the customer is always right. And the CIA can find itself in the answer fetching instead of the question asking business. And it can find itself in the business of making decisions easy for the customer, when in my view, the role of an intelligence analyst is actually to make decisions harder and to bring out the nuance and complexity and ambiguity in any given situation. So that's the essence of the book. I take those traits and I follow them through what's called the intelligence cycle, which is a highly idealized view of what happens in the world of intelligence, which is tasking. What do you wish to know? Collection, get the information about what you wish to know. Analysis, the heart of the matter, look at the information you collect. Production, put it into form for the consumer. And then, of course, you disseminate it. And you go through that cycle. And I trace the effect of those cultural features in the 4 surprises I talked about in each phase of tasking, of the intelligence cycle. And if it sounds a bit like a Swiss watch, you got it, right? It's a pretty turgid read if you're not an intelligence guy. I have to admit, maybe even if you're an intelligence guy, Mark will tell us. But that's the essence of the book. So I want to give you just a quick example of what I mean that your identity affects how you might perceive a problem or a question in international relations. If I say to you, a caveman, and most of you think that. You think that's a primitive person. And I hope you'll remember after 9/11, Richard Holbrooke said, how is it that a caveman is out communicating the greatest communication society on earth. And when we finally found Saddam Hussein, he was in a cave or a spider hole. Americans associate caves with primitivism, people you might dismiss. I hope I'm not going to get a letter from the National Association of Cave Persons now for defaming cave people, but I think that's a fair generalization. Apparently we're all some percentage Neanderthal anyway, so. But there's another type of caveman, Osama bin Laden, and he quite consciously chose to appear in caves. I bet there aren't too many Muslims in the audience. But a Muslim knows that far from being a sign of something primitive, in Islam, the cave is a holy place. When in art, the moment of the Gabriel giving the Quran to Muhammad can be portrayed at all, as it sometimes in Mughal art it could be, it happened in a cave. Cave was the place where the greatest revelation in the history of the universe occurred for humanity. A cave is a holy place, for starters. That's the site of God's revelation to believers. Secondly, how did I do that? When the prophet fled from Mecca to Medina, God performed 2 miracles, hiding him in a cave from his pursuers. He put a spider web in the way, and also I think some dove's eggs. But again, caves are where God does his business in Islam. Cavemen are good people. And then finally, when you look at some of the beautiful mosques that are currently being destroyed in Syria and other places, you see that what's called stalactite architecture. Again, that's because in Islamic art, where you have to keep things abstract, geometric references to stalactites and stalagmites are a reminder that God delivers his messages to humanity in caves. So Osama bin Laden had many ways of boosting his image among the people to whom he wanted to get his message across. And it started with appearing in caves. Also sitting a certain way, a beard of a certain length, a rifle of a certain type, etc. But I just hope that example of what a cave might mean to you versus what a cave might mean to a devout Muslim shows you how your identity and your culture shapes your perception of an objective fact, the cave, and the fact that a man speaks from a cave. Now finally, this is America. When you do a PhD in Britain, the last thing they want is recommendations and practical policy prescriptions. But nevertheless, I made some. And the first is, I modified the intelligence cycle. And I suggest that we need to put hypotheses back in. And we need to do that not only to remind analysts and the intelligence process that hypotheses lie at the heart of this, and that your identity and culture affects which hypotheses you permit and which ones you don't, but also to remind intelligence consumers that these are non-trivial problems. And it's finally an ideas network. And this is about making your decisions harder, not delivering you certainties on demand, as so many CNN commentators might be willing to do. Any economists in here who know Gresham's law? Gresham's law in economics states that counterfeit currencies drive out good currencies because people hoard the good and pass on the bad. So over time, their counterfeit currency drives out the good. I believe after 20 years of consulting, there's also Gresham's law of advice, which is bad advice drives out good advice. Anyone who comes in and says, well, actually, that's a complicated question, and it's quite nuanced, and I think you should be aware of the ambiguities, always loses out to the guy who says, absolutely not, the answer's 4, right? The certainty wins the day, but I want to reintroduce the role of ideas in all this. I'm hoping, in a modest way, that that inoculates the community if it's adopted. And then finally, I think diversity is of course there's a moral case for diversity, but I also think there's a practical case for diversity. And in a few of my case studies, I show how arguably more female analysts, more analysts from racial diversity and gender diversity, it's not a perfect proxy for cognitive diversity, but it's a good start. But if you have a CIA that resembles one particular segment of 4% of the world's population, you're not going to generate all possible hypotheses about what the next intelligence failure or strategic surprise might be. So I try to make a practical case for diversity in the intelligence community. I also believe passionately that American society is too obsessed with so-called practical education, and it underestimates the role of ideas. My daughter's 16 and she's already being talked to about a career. I think there's an argument to say that education is about understanding the best that's been read or written or thought or done before you lived, and then there's time to learn a career later. And similarly, even in American graduate programs, whether it's history or political science, I believe ontology, epistemology, and methodology is slighted in comparison, in particular, to what I got in Europe. So that's kind of a pitch for my adopted home team. I also think there's more room for open source intelligence, that it's still slighted in the community. I don't have time to get into that, and Mark will tell me more, I'm sure. I also think there's a big role to push back on the so-called consumers of intelligence and educate them that the intelligence agencies are not in the answer-fetching business. They are there to make questions arguably harder, not easier. And then finally, I truly believe that as a guy who waited an extra 4 months in comparison to all the other Marines I knew to get a top secret clearance, solely because I'd actually been to the USSR and learned Russian and spent time there. I'd also been to suspicious places like Guatemala and East Germany, whereas everyone else had frankly never left the United States. There's a balance somewhere, and I'm not sure that only farm boys from Iowa. I mean, look, the head of the bin Laden unit didn't speak Arabic. The head, I could be wrong, I don't believe Mr. Gates, when he was head of analysis, ever actually had gone to the Soviet Union, though he had a PhD in Soviet studies. If you had an Iranian who didn't speak English, who'd never been to the United States, analyzing likely moves of Obama, how likely is that? I think that's giving us a disadvantage. America's not good at languages, and it's not good about foreign travel, but I really would like to see the community find some way to get better at maintaining the security restrictions necessary, but also recruiting people with slightly more exposure to the 96% of the world that is not American. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
First of all, I want to assure Professor Jones his book is not turgid.
Oh, thank you.
It was an easy read.
Someone very kindly said the seams are still showing.
You know, and as somebody who minored in classics, I also congratulate you on getting Cassandra correct. Because most people see her as a false prophetess. That's not her problem. Her problem is the audience isn't getting the message. And as someone who's actually written an autobiography of a Greek god, which will take much too long to explain, I was really happy you got Cassandra right. But so I'm in this strange position where I disagree with a great deal of the book, but I agree with the conclusions. So let me explain to you how I get there. Now, when I was reading the book, I wasn't thinking about Cassandra. I was thinking about a different Greek legend, that's Procrustes. For those of you who know the Theseus story, Procrustes had a little inn on the road to Athens and an iron bed, which he offered to travelers. And the trouble was, everybody had to fit the bed. So if you were too short, he put you on the rack first to stretch you out. And if you were too tall, he amputated your limbs so that you fit in. And I felt, with no offense, that there was a Procrustean model at work here, the model that you saw on that very complex chart. So to go back again, Professor Jones has 4 basic attributes that he was assessing. The homogeneity of the CIA's workforce. And we're only talking about the CIA in this book. Right. We're not talking about the other 15 or 16 agencies, depending how you count. There's a penchant for secrecy, the scientism in the analysis, and the drive for consensus. And I would say at the outset that he's describing a CIA that either doesn't exist now or never existed, at least in my experience as both an analyst in the community and as a historian. So let me just sort of tick off why I think that. The workforce. The workforce he's describing did exist once, in about the 1960s and 1950s, and then it stopped. And the white, male, Ivy League, predominantly Princeton and Yale, not so much Harvard and Brown, workforce stopped. Certainly the workforce that I helped supervise was very mixed. I would say the male-female component was close to equal. Fair number of minorities, with the noticeable exception of African-American males. Now, as somebody who is responsible for all the analysts and all the intelligence community, I can tell you this was a major frustration in my life. Now, how do you get people in the intelligence community? We don't have a draft. You can't even draft people into the Army. You can draft people into the NFL, apparently, but that's about it. And let's not get into that. CIA puts ads in newspapers. They put ads on TV, on jets. When I'm flying around the country, there'll be an ad sometime, and they'll show the Economist ad. And they set up tables at schools. And it's an all-volunteer force. The people who show up get recruited. And the people who don't show up don't recruited, so they self-select. And we've had a problem with African-American males stemming back to a crisis during the Clinton administration and a bunch of horrible newspaper articles in the San Jose Mercury alleging that the CIA was prosecuting the war in Nicaragua to get drugs to dump in the ghetto. Let's let that go. And so this created this legend, and it made it very difficult. I used to get sent to the annual conference of historically black colleges to do recruiting, and I always used to say, the white Jewish guy is not your best option here, but I was the assistant director. So we had this problem, and we still have the problem with the African-American males, but the rest of the workforce does not resemble, and has not resembled for decades, the workforce being described.
Mark, can I just ask
please.
a question? Wasn't there a lawsuit by the female employees of the CIA twice alleging widespread discrimination?
I have no, I don't know.
I think it's in the.
Then
There was.
Then there had to have been female
There
employees to be
were indeed, and they alleged widespread
Well,
discrimination.
that may have happened.
What was the nickname of the Bin Laden unit?
It was the Alex Station.
Right, Alex. What was the nickname of Alex Station
I have
within the?
no idea.
I'm told it was the Manson family, because
Well,
you
that may
had
have been because of
the
who
beard,
hated.
you had the bearded guy and all his female groupies, as they were called.
I don't think
who-
that goes to the general case, though. It may
Okay,
be true,
fair
but I don't think that goes to the way the workforce looks, and it looks the way it looks. It is more heterogeneous, it is more world-resembling, and is more mixed in male and female. The white, male, Ivy League workforce retired around 1970. On the secrecy thing, well, yeah, that's what we do. We get secrets. Now, I have a reputation of being an open source advocate. I spent part of my career in open source intelligence. We're never going to do that well. I used to tell Director Tennant we should have a sign over the 123 entrance, secrets are us. But secrets are in part why you have an intelligence community. If you get it openly, you wouldn't need us. So saying that we go after secrets, well, yeah, that's the purpose. The scientism one is where I have the greatest problems, because the analysis being described in the book just doesn't resemble the way I did analysis or the way I've watched other people do analysis. I just disagree. I don't think that's how they do their work. And that's a major part of the book, and I just disagree with it. And on the last part of the consensus thing, this is a problem. And there is a certain drive for consensus on occasion. Policymakers do not want laundry lists. They don't want to be told, well, sir, the option A may happen, or B, or C, or D. They can make up a laundry list. They want you to tell them A is more likely than B, D is not going to happen, I'd worry a little bit about C. And so there is a certain drive to consensus. We do have means, we do have vehicles for teasing out the outlier views, and this is a problem. The trouble with the Cassandras is that what you don't understand about intelligence analysis is that it is a rough and tumble sport. There are winners and there are losers. This is not a win-win. Milo's memo goes forward and mine hits the trash barrel. His career is now doing better than my career, and it is a competitive atmosphere. And sometimes the Cassandras may just be the losers. It may not be that they have a better vision. It may be that they lost the argument. So for those reasons, I have concerns about the structure of the book. There are 4 case studies, and I want to just go through them very, very fast. The Iran 1979 case, the main problem here was that successive presidents of the United States, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, all told the CIA the same thing. Thou shalt not collect on the opposition, because according to the Shah, there isn't one. And B, you may not go into the sheikhs and collect. So to say that the CIA was blind, well, the CIA may be a lot of things, but they're not stupid. And when the president says you will not collect on the opposition, they don't collect on the opposition. So yes, we didn't see part of it coming, but you have to ask yourself, whose fault was that? And I would lay a great deal of that responsibility on the Shah, the Savak, and the presidents.
By the way, the reason that was so crucial is Iran was providing us with signals intelligence sites to watch Soviet telemetry tests so we could monitor the SALT agreements.
Right,
So it was not a tribute. It wasn't just
no.
stay out of Iran to be nice. It was stay out of Iran so we can continue to watch the Soviet Union, which was the prime target of the CIA.
And the Shah also cut interesting deals. I'll take F-14s at rock bottom prices. You can have oil at top dollar prices. There were some interesting things going on. This is what happened. The fall of the Soviet Union, and I bear some responsibility for this case, not for the fall of the Soviet Union, although I'd be happy to contribute, and maybe I did
I
in some
played
way.
a small part in its downfall as well.
But this was one where a lot of us were saying it's going under. But telling that to the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor, not really interesting. Telling him when it's going to happen and whether it's going to go down peaceably, which nobody predicted. Nobody thought that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union would one day walk away and say, okay, we're done. We're going home. It's yours. Have a nice day. So that's one where the general prediction was fairly easy. The specific prediction might have been nearly impossible. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the one we agree. The Cassandra, in this case, exists and happens to be the Director of Central Intelligence, John McCone. He disagrees with his own agency's analysis, and he says, I think you guys are missing a bet. But what he didn't know, he might have known, what the analysts didn't know is what Khrushchev did know. Khrushchev started the crisis because John Kennedy had performed so badly at Vienna the year before that Khrushchev decided, I can take this kid. This is a callow, wet behind the ears kid, and I can run him crazy. And no American analyst was going to have access to any analysis that said the president just bombed in Vienna. That is not going to show up in American documents. And the fourth case, the 9/11 case, we had strategic warning. What we didn't have was tactical warning. Stop those 4 planes on this Tuesday morning.
Mark, I have to ask, Mark, we had strategic warning in some sense, but if we had strategic warning, why was the tasking, why was Al-Qaeda as a tasking target given the same priority as the trade in illegal tropical hardwood?
That's not
under
true. I'm sorry.
Under the Clinton
That is
administration.
categorically not true. As somebody who wrote the reclama to the 9/11 Commission report,
Okay.
I'm telling you that part of the report, fiction would not begin to describe.
So that part of the 9/11, so because I pulled it from the 9/11
Well,
Commission report.
I think
but-
the 9/11 Commission report, and I've said this many times, is one of the most overrated documents in American history. And I belong to the Posner School.
Mm-hmm.
It has no internal cohesion, and the recommendations bear no resemblance to the findings. Let me make a couple of other observations, then get to your conclusions. Strategic warning is our highest priority. Pearl Harbor is why we exist. But we have other functions as well. And there's a really good book called Analyzing Intelligence by Roger George and James Bruce. 2 men, no last name between them. Roger George, James Bruce. There's a really good chapter by Richard Kerr, who is the acting DCI under Bush 41. And he takes 50 years of CIA analysis and says, how do we do? And he says, in terms of keeping policymakers, a very diverse set of policymakers, fairly well informed and allowing them to either avoid major crises or thread their way through major crises without major conflict, we did pretty well. And that's another function of the intelligence community. And finally, as to estimates, and Milo spends a lot of time on national estimates, the 9/11 Commission is way overly involved in national estimates. As somebody used to be responsible for them, it's not our only product, and they are not predictions. They're not even forecasts. What they are is an estimate. We think this is the most likely outcome. This is a less likely outcome. Well, don't worry about this. But they are not predictions. And whether or not you write an estimate is not the indicator of whether or not an issue is important. And this is one of the flaws in the 9/11 report. Now, back to the recommendations. Now, here, we're in pretty much total agreement. We do need to keep pursuing diversity across the intelligence community, not because we're nice people, but because it gives us a mixed workforce, some of whom will think differently about issues which they have the right culture, the right language. I was also responsible for the language programs in the intelligence community. Mine was not a cushy job on occasion. And language training in the United States is abysmal. Tasking can be problematic. The highest goal, I think, of the intelligence community is to anticipate what the policymaker needs before she articulates the need for it, and give it to her in a way that she will consume it. And that's an art form. I agree with education, don't train. First of all, this is how I make my living in my company. We provide courses on intelligence. And if those of you who are wondering the difference between education and training, this is the only thing you can remember that I said all night. This is the difference. You want your kids to have sex education. You do not want them to have sex training. And unfortunately, we do training for our analysts, and we need to educate them. And finally, I agree. The use of the word customers is problematic. Because it implies an entire economic relationship that really doesn't exist, and we haven't come up with a better phrase. So we're in this interesting position where I think we disagree analytically, but I think we're in violent agreement on the things that we could do better in the intelligence community.
I'm prepared to accept most of that. I want to push back a little bit on the 9/11 case and the idea that there was strategic warning. And also the idea that, and now you really, this is your trade, so educate me.
As opposed to training.
Correct. I thought that one of the real points of the National Intelligence Estimate is to unify the rest of the community around and educate them on the importance of a particular question.
Mm-hmm.
So that if you're at the FBI, say, in 1990, well, in 2000, and you haven't seen al-Qaeda's name or Osama bin Laden's name, and there hasn't even been a National Intelligence Estimate on terrorism since 1997, and Osama bin Laden gets mentioned once as a terrorist financier, and I think al-Qaeda gets 2 sentences, that, if you're in the Florida field office or the Michigan field office, your bosses don't take the fact that, gosh, there are these guys who are taking flying lessons, but they're not interested in learning to land. They don't take it seriously. So that, yes, I agree that the president doesn't sit down and read NIEs, but the rest of the community does.
But
and
not
it's hard to see the
Florida field offices.
Right?
See,
but
that's part of the problem.
my larger point is that there was what's called in academics a sort of dialogue failure about America as a whole, about the possibility of terrorism. And so when you say there's a failure of imagination, well, there certainly wasn't a failure of imagination by Osama bin Laden about what he could do. And apparently there wasn't a failure by the head of Alex Station, who, and again, I only know open sources, but my understanding is he came out and jumped the chain of command, wrote to the head of the CIA and the next 6 people down in 1999, 98,
I remember when
and said, capture or kill bin Laden. He's a dangerous guy. And he got called in, told he's out of balance, and made a librarian at Langley until September 12th, 2001, when he's called back as special advisor to the bin Laden unit.
To be a successful Cassandra, you have to know how to win friends and influence people. And the individual in question
Does not know how to do that.
not his higher calling. Part of this is an interpersonal skill.
I do bring that up in the book.
Yeah, and you did.
It's the sociology of knowledge. This is why do people get ignored.
I sort of put an exclamation point and chuckled because I knew this individual.
A lot of the Soviet
But I have to
economists
say,
who
on
are
the
more...
9/11 thing, as again, I wrote the reclama portion
Okay.
of this for the director. I was what's called the pen. So I was collecting all these data from the rest of the building. We had reams of memos about al-Qaeda, warning about the capabilities, warning about the likelihood of a threat to the United States proper. So the fact that there wasn't an estimate is an irrelevance. There were plenty of papers, community papers, papers that were being seen by everybody who needed to see it. The fact that there wasn't one labeled NIE is just of no consequence whatsoever. And this is the thing that Zeliko's staff fastened on. And I will say to you again that whether or not you write an NIE is not the telltale of the importance of an issue to the analysts and to the community. And in fact, there are many reasons why you would say that an NIE is the last thing you'd want to write, because at this point, an NIE is a strategic document. At this point, we're down to a tactical problem. We have incoming. And getting the analysts together to do a strategic analysis was turning into a tactical issue, I might even argue, might have been inappropriate at the time.
So I thank you, both gentlemen. We're now going to open it up to the audience for questions. I have several of my own, but I think we're going to get a certain, yeah, okay. So we're going to go straight to the audience. And sir, I saw you first. If you wait for a second for us to bring you a microphone before you ask your question.
There are 2 other instances, probably not covered in your book, that are worth examination. The first is Sputnik. Those of us who lived through it, this was a major shock. Although
Stock market fell 8% or something.
the New York Times listed an announcement weeks before by the Soviets that they were going to launch this, and yet it came, everyone was dumbfounded, and Americans were frightened, and you had this thing about the inferiority of American scientific education. And the other more serious was the Bay of Pigs, which led to Alan Dulles being fired, which was not an easy thing to do. But in theory, both of the full histories of these should be unclassified by now, and I'd like to hear your reactions to these two events.
Well, one is putatively analytic, and that's Sputnik. Bay of Pigs is just an operational disaster. One of my mentors, a man named Sam Halpern, who is Richard Helm's executive officer, wrote the first in-house analysis of what happened, and he was called into Helm's office, and Dick said to Sam, "What went wrong?" And Sam said, "Everything imaginable." So that's an operation. But the Sputnik thing, there's an interesting issue with intelligence during the Cold War. The United States government knew that the Soviet Union was about to launch something into space. This is the problem that you have if you're President Eisenhower, who is one of the most underrated presidents of the 20th century. If I tell the American public, incoming, Sputnik, October, then the Soviets know that I know, and I blow my sources. So I'm not going to do that, and I will write out the surprise because I want to keep getting intelligence from the Soviets. It's a very difficult, same thing when Khrushchev is blustering about how many missiles he's producing, and he was blowing up 100 megaton bombs in Novaya Zemlya. And Eisenhower knew what the strategic balance was. We could cripple them. But again, if he sticks a pin in Khrushchev's propaganda balloon, then the Russians know that we know, and Eisenhower doesn't want to do it. This is one of the problems with intelligence. How much of it do you let out for public diplomacy, risking sources and methods?
It's not only, if I may say, not only a question of risking sources and methods, but you can also have self-altering predictions, in which you predict something's going to happen, and then they know that you know, so they don't do it, and then you look stupid, and you begin to doubt your sources and methods, and something else occurs. So and this, in the case of the collapse of the Soviet Union, I am prepared to concede that there was an element of this, that the last thing you needed to do if you were worried about a giant version of Yugoslavia with nukes forming was, oh yeah, and we're not quite sure that Yeltsin fellow is going to make it either, or that Gorbachev fellow is going to make it. So there are problems. I call intelligence success as the dark matter of studying this, because you can only, as you know, about 90x% of the universe is dark matter, and we can't perceive it. We're only now learning to measure that it's even there. But when you're studying intelligence, as Vince said, the failures are what get attention. And I believe there's value in looking at Cassandras to make sure that those failures remain informative.
I would like to mention I was doing a reserve tour in spring of '96 down CENTCOM, and some guy named Osama bin Laden was an item on the J2's brief, and this was in '96. And I asked after the briefing, I said, "Who is he?" And they said, "Oh, he's a rich Saudi pushing terrorism." I guess one thing I'd be curious, having spent my life in security and counterintelligence, how would you change the vetting process? After guys like Private Manning and Snowden, I would say our vetting processes are not robust enough.
I have no specific magic formula for deciding who is a narcissist possibly working with Chinese and Soviet intelligence, turning over documents, most of which have nothing to do with American privacy, to the world, as Mr. Snowden is. But I also have no specific knowledge of how to improve vetting. But I'll just tell, as I say, every theory is a fragment of autobiography. When I went to business school, I thought, oh my God, really? I have to study business? Ugh, that sounds rather dull. I'll do it outside America. And I had friends go to Wharton and Harvard and the University of Chicago. And CIA recruiters showed up to recruit MBAs who go to Wharton, Harvard, and the University of Chicago. Well, my friends at London Business School and INSEAD and IMD and places like IE, all of whom have to speak a foreign language to get into these programs and stay in these programs. No CIA recruiter shows up there. I guess they can't get budget to go abroad and find Americans who've lived abroad, are interested in foreigners, and actually can communicate with them in their own tongue. I mean, somewhere out there, we've got to strike a better balance. And we need to be recruiting beyond the campuses of American continental universities. Now, maybe we are, and I don't know it, but I didn't see it. And it just struck me as an irony.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Whatever you think about the rise of the Ayatollah in Iran, you surely both must agree that the decision to admit the Shah here for medical treatment was one of the most catastrophic ever. It sounds like the Republican establishment at the time was the only people supporting it, and every other person opposed it. Second question, what's the number of percentage of CIA employees who speak a foreign language?
The Shah was admitted by a Democrat. I hate to throw a monkey wrench in, but Mr. Carter is definitely not a Republican. I have this on good authority. I'm close to 100% certainty on that one. But there may... Oh, hardly. I don't think they even speak. As for what percentage of the CIA analysts speak a foreign language, I have no idea, and B, if I did, I couldn't tell you anyway. So I will tell you, look, this is a problem across America in education. I teach a course down the street at Hopkins, and I ask my students, how many of you speak a foreign language? And these are graduate students. Very few of them have a foreign language capacity. Very few Americans get out of college doing other than the necessary 4 terms or passing out of the Spanish exam where their high school Spanish held up long enough for them to sit through the exam. This is a national problem. Now, part of it makes sense because we're an immigrant society, and one of the ways you assimilate people is by making them all speak the same language. It's an assimilation thing. My grandmother was an immigrant, and her children, my mother and my aunts and uncles, would tell her, Mom, you're in America now. No Yiddish. Speak English. And it's interesting, the oldest of the children spoke English and Yiddish. When the time you got to my mother, who was the youngest, she couldn't speak Yiddish. So this is how we assimilate people in the United States. The trouble is we've never valued foreign language as something to study. Again, as I say, I was responsible for all the programs, and it would drive me absolutely crazy. So I'll tell you a story. So one year, my language monitor comes to me, and she was very excited. We had the data from the Modern Language Association on the 3 highest growth languages for that academic year. It was 2003, 2004. And it was Arabic. I thought, this is really good. Biblical Hebrew, I was very proud, but I don't know whether the utility of it was. And American Sign Language, which is a foreign language. So I said, if we're fighting deaf, dead Israelis, we are so on top of our game. So, no, this is a serious. Now, it's not just foreign language. There are 6,000. You're getting more information than you wanted. I'm an analyst. There are 6,000 non-Roman alphabet foreign languages. So the heck with the ones written in Roman, all the Romance languages, all the European languages, as long as you're staying on the left side of Berlin. And then, you get into Ukrainian, Russian, Hindi, Urdu, Chinese, Japanese, Hebrew. We're just not there. But it's a national problem. I used to get reamed in front of my old committee for this, and finally I lost it one night and I didn't care anymore. And I said to a congressman, sir, your high schools and your colleges in your district are not teaching these kids languages. Why is it my fault when they get to CIA? You know what? It's not my fault. It's your fault.
I just want to echo that a lot of what I say about the CIA merely reflects American culture. And that's important to keep in mind when you read the book. The second thing is, well, we're running out of time, so I'll leave it at that.
I can actually add to this conversation. I know that at certain grad schools, to get a PhD in certain fields in history, you have to have languages.
Yeah, I do.
And in most cases, the tests are 4-hour-long tests taken on computers. Well, because of modern internet technology and translate functions, some schools have had to get rid of that.
Yes.
Because you could just cut and paste the foreign language onto your computer, hit Google Translate, and then never actually have to learn the language. And so, you could go by the honor system, but you get run into a situation where you really actually don't even have to learn the language in many cases.
Again, we're prone to scientism.
Question for both of you. You know, there are various trends we see occurring in the world today. Some of the activities in the cyber domain, DoD's trying to rebalance more toward Asia Pacific. I'd be interested in what changes you think need to be made in education, in the education of analysts. You've already alluded to, you know, some of the shortcomings of our national education system, foreign languages. I'd add geography to that. I'd even add personal finance to that. So I'd be interested in what new emerging educational requirements do you think need to be stressed with educating analysts?
Mark, why don't you have a go at that first?
All right, we actually, Rod, there's an in-house problem. 65% of the analysts in the intelligence community have 6 years of experience or less because of the huge influx that we took in after 9/11. So I always think about the Duke of Wellington reviewing his troops, and he said, I don't know what effect they have on the enemy, but they sure scare me. And most of those analysts have spent 10 or 11 years of their life now on tactical issues, counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. And now we're telling them, pivot to the Pacific, or start worrying about Russia again. They're making a comeback. And those are strategic issues. And these kids have never done strategic analysis in their lives. And I have the view, and so do most of my colleagues, that it's much easier to go from strategic to tactical than to go from tactical to strategic. So we're going to have to sort of the heck with the people we're recruiting. We have a huge in-house education problem because they're going to have to be shifted to a bunch of areas, issues that they just have never worked on before. The incoming kids would be easy to deal with. We have these other people with 10 years of tactical. I think that's a severe problem.
I think it goes deeper. I think, again, it's a reflection of American society. I think we live in a country that has trouble naming and describing things accurately to itself in a civil way. You can say that that's how the great democracy holds together. But when you declare war on an emotion, for example, terror, that's like, in the Second World War, did we declare war on blitzkrieg, a tactic? It's very difficult to move in that, and you saw some of that before 9/11. I mean, part of the reason we didn't talk about terrorism is news organizations didn't remember one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And the BBC, for example, stopped allowing its correspondents to talk about terrorists because that A, offended some communities, and B, for example, I mean, they had the Northern Ireland problem, and still do, and B, that makes life dangerous for journalists. So it's far better if you refer to people as, say, insurgents, and you have this sort of value-free, relativistic view. Well, finally, language matters because ideas matter, and if you can't think clearly and name things clearly, then you run into all sorts of muddy thinking. And I have no way to solve that problem, but maybe pointing it out is a slight inoculation against particular forms of idiocy. Maybe not.
How does our CIA stack up to foreign intelligence services? Are they better than us, doing things right? Are we learning from them? Are they learning from us?
No, I'm probably biased here. No, I really do think, as somebody who's written a lot about this, I think we have the most capable intelligence services in the world in terms of providing policymakers with good intelligence. We probably have one of the largest ones. Is not what makes you better, but I think we have one of the better ones. It's actually easier to write intelligence in the United States than it is in a lot of countries where you've got to come up with the right answer, meaning I didn't like that answer, that's the wrong answer. Do they learn from us? Of course. I mean, they go to school on us, we go to school on them. That's one of the reasons you have secrets. But I think that our service, and again, this chapter that I mentioned before by Dick Kerr is a very informative chapter about the day-to-day service that you provide to policymakers to sort of help them figure out left-right guidance. You know, what's the parameters of the road I'm working on? It's never going to make a great movie. Let's be serious about it. But it's a tremendous service that if you can help The goal of intelligence analysis is to help policymakers reduce their level of uncertainty, not eliminate it. But if you can do that on a consistent basis, that's a tremendous service to a policymaker. Think about what the incoming desk looks like of the President, the Secretary of State, the Chairman of Joint Chiefs. If you can help him weave through that with a fair amount of certainty day to day, that's a pretty good service. It really is. It's not dramatic. It's never going to make a great movie. There's only been one movie about intelligence analysts, and it was horrible. It was the 3 Days of the Condor, which is just, it's boring beyond belief. But you're never going to have a great movie about intelligence analysts. It's just not what we do. But I think that's a really useful service, and I think we're very good at it on a consistent basis. We don't get it right all the time. Now, that's part of the problem with the newspapers, Their barrier is, well, you got that wrong, you're toast. But I always tell classes that I teach, it's a baseball thing. Fielding and hitting. If you're a baseball fielder, 950 average, or you're sitting down. If you're a hitter, 260 average. So sometimes we get the 950 question. Who's the vice premier for industrial production in Pyongyang? Give me 5 minutes, I'll get you an answer. Sometimes you get a batting question. What's Kim Jong-un going to do next? Oh, yeah. All right. Howard, question for the audience. How many of you know what you're eating for dinner tonight? Dinner's a couple of hours out. How many of you know? 1, 2, 3. So I've got 3 out of about 35 people. Okay, next question. What's Kim Jong-un going to do next? So you can't have dinner. Oh, yeah, but he's the only one in Pyongyang who's eating. So you can't answer for a meal that's 2 hours out. And now I want you to answer for this Looney Tune in North Korea. So that's part of the issue. How right you're supposed to be depends on the question you're being asked.
There's in the book, I talk about a cone of uncertainty, and you should be able to at least define the limits of the cone.
Absolutely.
I think our analytical corps is the largest and most skilled in many, many aspects in the history of the world. I admit I have more ignorance about, but also more concern about our clandestine service and our collectors there. The idea that, well, we don't have enough analysts at NSA, so we're going to outsource our intercepts from Afghanistan prior to 9/11. You know who we outsourced those to? Because we didn't have the linguists. So we let the Pakistani ISI feed us the intel on that. And things like that are a problem. And we also, Americans like careers. You join a thing like the CIA or the Marine Corps, you want a career. And a career, American careers, all right, you're going to have to be away from your family, but it'll only be a year. Or you can take your family with you, but it's going to be the capital city, and it's going to be only for 3 years. And so you say, it's impossible to infiltrate an organization like the Taliban, American, walking around the capital cities of the Middle East pretending to be Canadian businessman or a visa officer isn't going to infiltrate a thing like that. So we think, it's impossible. Well, I'm sorry, wasn't there some granola-eating wacko from California who managed to actually infiltrate the Taliban pretty effectively in the years prior to that? Well, he was on the ground more than the CIA was he
He
not?
agreed to be a soldier in the Taliban. The entry requirements was to be a Muslim and to be willing to carry a rifle. It's not exactly like penetrating.
No, I completely concede he was not in the inner councils, but he was on the ground more, and I would suggest that our National Clandestine Service could use more people who are prepared to be away from home for very long periods of time under very uncomfortable conditions, far from the capital city, without any hope of a career as we conventionally understand it. And I don't know how you solve that problem, and I don't know too many countries that are good at it. The Russians are prepared to do illegals. I've never heard any hint that America does things like illegals. We don't ask our people to move to a foreign country, assume a separate identity, and live there for the next 3 decades.
This is really fascinating, and I am a granola eating hippie from California.
Yeah, me too, actually.
How do you feel about carrying a rifle and being a Muslim?
I'll stay in California.
Although you're a woman, so we're going to have a little drawback here on the.
You're not wearing a vest, are you?
My question is, it's really fascinating hearing you both talk about striking a balance and, the changes of the CIA and over the years. And I think that everything that came out about the NSA and their surveillance of phone records and metadata and gathering all of that data for analysis, it seems like there needs to be a balance there also of privacy and gathering information about things that could possibly happen in the future or trends. And I would be really curious to hear your opinions, both of your opinions, about how to strike a balance in that realm as well.
I have my problems with big data generally. I think it has a tendency to make the haystack bigger rather than help you find the needles at times. I also had not heard that foreigners have any particular constitutional right to privacy. And I think most of the outrage by foreigners about the activities of the NSA is feigned for domestic consumption. It's amazing to me the degree to which the information that has come out was particularly damaging to America's most important strategic relationship, or some of America's most important strategic relationships at the time. Gosh, we sure upset the Brazilians, right, when we sort of needed the Brazilians. And we sure upset the Germans. And I think there's a lot more to that story, but I have no particular information. I would just suggest to you that thousands and thousands and thousands of documents that Mr. Snowden took have nothing to do with your Skype account or email or how the NSA might look at them. There is a balance out there somewhere. I'm a civil libertarian to my soul, but I have a fair amount of trust that most of the time collection does not mean surveillance. And you're not under surveillance just because your phone records have been collected. Mark?
Judge Posner, whom I've cited before, makes an interesting comment about how much of your personal privacy you have freely given away. Those of us who live in this area have an easy pass. They know when you hit the highway, they know when you leave it, so don't use that car for, a bank job.
The KGB would have loved Visa cards.
That's right. You go to Giant, and they say, whoa, more Twinkies. What happened to the broccoli you said you were buying? You get on Amazon, and hey, welcome back. And there's a list of books and CDs and so you've actually frittered away reams of your personal privacy for minor economic gain. You don't want the government doing that. Fine. That's fine. And we understand that. After every major intelligence failure, there's always a study or two. In Pearl Harbor, there were 9 in the first 5 years. They all have the same recommendation: more intelligence collection. Don't let this happen again. And so that's what we did. Congress passed a law. This wasn't done in the dead of night. The Congress of the United States passed a law. The president signed it, and then the intelligence community took action. You don't like it, you change the law. That's how democracy works. But this is one of the great, interesting stories in American history, is the constant recalibration between personal freedom and security. And you want both, and you don't want to bargain either way, and I would never suggest bargaining both ways. But it's a tick-tock kind of thing. It goes, Abraham Lincoln suspends habeas corpus in the state of Maryland. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger B. Taney, as they pronounce it in Maryland, says you can't do that. And he says, yes, I can. That's it, I think one of the greatest injustice in American history, in terms of civil liberties, we threw 110,000 Americans into prison camps because they happened to be Japanese. And the Supreme Court said it was legal. Now this, by the way, if you've never been to the monument to the Japanese-American prisoners, it's near the Capitol, one of the most touching monuments in Washington. It's small in the size of the room. So this is one of the great problems in American history. And it's a back and forth kind of thing. And you'll never get it right because there's no right, there's no center. It's a constant recalibration. And we're good at it most of the time. And every so often we have to, play with the dial again and move it left or right, more towards one than the other. But you never hit steady. You never hit, okay, that's it, we got it, we're done. We can go home now.
I think it's also important to remember that the impulse of every bureaucracy, as one of my cynical friends said, we may not be preparing to prevent the next 9/11, but we sure are preparing for the next 9/11 commission. Look, we start with how many strategic targets in America? I think about 1,000 in the year after 9/11, and we're now up to, I think, 300,000, including the something like the Indiana Pork and Apple Festival.
Omaha
and that,
Zoo.
The Omaha
The
Zoo
Omaha
was a
Zoo that was
terrorist
my
attack.
favorite.
Every kind. I mean, this is. I actually set out to write a book about the American intelligence community, and then my PhD advisor wisely said, no, you got to narrow it, and you got to narrow it fast. But this is not a CIA problem. This is an American dialogue. And frankly, the CIA is the most open intelligence agency in the history of the world, and that is a reflection of America, and I'm very happy for that. It needs secrets, though. Modern societies need secret services like they need post offices. Although I guess that sort of dates me, because I guess post offices are on. But you get my point. We need them, and they need to have secrets, and they need at times to dig into people's private lives and do deeply unpleasant things. And that's a trade-off we make to remain civilizations.
I have a question I would love to ask the panel and the group as well. I've studied national security for the past few years myself, and I came across a source that said if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear when it comes to Americans and civil liberties. And I've really taken that perspective about the whole idea. And I'd just like to ask as a group, how do we feel about that? Because I stand behind that 100%, and I'm just curious as a group, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear when it comes to your civil liberties. That's really how I feel about it, and I'm just curious. So.
I don't feel that way about it. And I say that as an intelligence officer. I don't think that the government has carte blanche to investigate anything they want in everyone's personal lives. First of all, I think it's wrong constitutionally. Second of all, it would destroy the intelligence community. They would be buried in data. And I agree, big data is a solution looking for a problem. And I don't think that's the right response. Good intelligence is targeted. If you share a name with a known terrorist, and you come up on the net and they realize you're the wrong guy, why would I waste my time, my resources on you? What an absolute waste, criminal waste of time. I got to go find the other one of you. So no, I don't think that's a good yardstick. I think it's too broad and you waste resources.
All right, I say this as someone who actually lived in the People's Republic of China for 5 years, and I have experience working for the state-run media of China. Actually, we used to work for Chinese Central Television. If there was a place where you feel that you have nothing to hide, it's under the Communist Party of China, and particularly if you live in the capital. And it's not so much necessarily that you're doing something bad that makes that wrong. It's that you might choose someday to do something that might be aggressive. And many things you can do that are aggressive are entirely legal or entirely appropriate, and particularly given the freedoms that we have in America. But if you feel that you're in that type of environment, you are curtailed. And it is not a pleasant sensation. And there's nothing that'll make you understand why we have the freedoms that we do, like life in an authoritarian state. So I think that it's something that I feel relatively strongly about. And it's based on that experience of having been over there. And so, I don't have anything to hide in particular, but you're watching me now. No, I know that you're
Look, I'm cynical.
Yeah.
I was about to ask whether you're married or not.
No, but it is something that I do feel strong, that I, the mere fact you have nothing to hide doesn't mean it's not, I mean, I don't feel, I cannot agree, given your basic assertion.
Communist societies and governments have a long history of propaganda, disinformation, and deception. From your research, have there been occasions when this has colored intelligence analysis?
There were actually instances where the KGB was using American satellite photographs to catch out commissars who are lying about grain production in their particular areas. Talk about mirror imaging. So they were using stolen intelligence about their own society to police their own society. Look, we live in a world of propaganda as well, and highly filtered information. You go to watch television in an Islamic country, and whether it's an American bomber or an Israeli bomber or something, if it does a surgical strike, we don't see the pictures of the collateral damage, people shoveling their relatives up off the sidewalk. In Arab societies, they frequently do. NBC News doesn't show you the gross stuff. You live in a world of filtered information. at all times. And I'm not saying that's intentional propaganda, but I'm also saying that we are not the world's. There are many ways, as I say, your identity and where you live shapes the information you're getting and how you perceive it. So yes, absolutely, we are all subject to propaganda and interpret different things as propaganda. On the other hand, I'm not a moral relativist, and I am no fan of communist propaganda. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Actually, to go back to Milo's book, in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets ran a fairly successful disinformation campaign directly at the president. There's this lovely picture of the president and Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister, and Dobrynin, the long-time serving Soviet ambassador, and they're all smiling, laughing. And they were lying through their teeth about what they were doing in Cuba. I mean, they ran this very, up to a certain point, effective disinformation campaign.
I thought the Soviet ambassador himself was lied to.
Possibly. But it's the Soviet Union. Anyway, but the point is, you know, when the foreign minister of another country comes into the president and blatantly lies to him, that's an interesting sort of high-stakes kind of thing. So, you know, there's an instance in the book, and Milo mentions this, where they did run a disinformation campaign to hope to gain time to get the missiles on the ground and up and operational prior to the United States being able to act. And we know this stuff goes on all the time.
What's more interesting is how we're seeing that world now blend in with operational realities in a place like Ukraine, where in effect you have state actors and non-state actors and official propaganda and merely pressured media and disinformation all blending together to help create facts on the ground and the interpretation of those facts. If you watch German media now, I'm sorry, but they all say, well, you know, boy, Putin's kind of got a point. And that's not because there's blatant Russian propaganda. It's because for a decade, Russia carefully cultivated German industry, including paying Mr. Schroeder 3 days after he leaves office 200 million euros, that's $300 million roughly, to join the board of Gazprom. And what a surprise. He's saying, I think Putin's kind of got a point. Now, if one of our presidents, 3 days after leaving office, went on a corporate board of a foreign state-owned enterprise and accepted $300 million for the deal, America would be outraged. But Germany, meh.
So is there any other questions after that? So, well, all right, so we'll go that gentleman, and then you'll have the final question, and we'll wrap it up.
Well, excellent presentation. I want to add on two questions about counterintelligence and deception. So first, you criticize the intelligence officers for having not a sufficient understanding of the culture of the target. But isn't there also a danger that the intelligence officers could have a too well understanding of the culture of the target, so that they actually identify with the opposition and then get their loyalties confused about who they are actually working for or what to think about it? And secondly, should a theory of intelligence not take counterintelligence more seriously? So it happens that there can be a well-placed mole who can tamper with intelligence, and that can affect analysis.
Just ask the British.
It can also be a case of subversion, as you pointed out. So some gradual process of subversion that also affects the intelligence community and, as a result, introduces bias in the analysis.
Oh, there's always a risk of an analyst, what I would call going native, forgetting who they're analyzing or who's side. Not, you know, it's not that they've become disloyal and defected, but they've lost the perspective. You're an American analyst working on the, you know, Upper Slavovian problem. You're not an Upper Slavovian. Stop that. So, I mean, yeah, that happens. That's one of the reasons why you want analysts to move around from topic to topic, not because they're disloyal, but because they stop thinking interesting thoughts. As for counterintelligence, look, it's always going to be a stepchild. I'm sorry. Yes, you always have to worry about there being a mole somewhere in the building, but you can't take it to sort of Angletonian extremes where you allow that to cripple your operation, which I can't trust anybody. You always have to be alert to the possibility that you've been penetrated. It's one of the overhead costs of doing business. But you can't let that cripple you.
For example, you can't let it prevent you from recruiting talented linguists from the American immigrant community, just in the fear that, oh my gosh, well, he may actually be a Gujarati speaker, but he's actually loyal to a breakaway state in India. There's a trade-off there somewhere, but it's a legitimate problem. I have some, I think the suggestions made by Book, I have some other suggestions, certainly in the PhD, that talk about some profoundly unconstitutional thought experiments based on Russian trust operations that that you essentially set up think tanks that attract the sort of people who would, the last thing they do is work for the CIA. But in effect, they're actually providing fresh ideas to the CIA after all. There are things like that you can do, and therefore sort of get the opposition working for you without knowing they're working for you. But again, I'm not a lawyer, so and nor do I have the luxury of running thought experiments that men like Mark do not have that and many other luxuries that academics have.
Thank you. I was really hoping somebody else would ask this question, but intelligence failures is the topic, and I'm wondering why you didn't include a fifth intelligence failure, and that is the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. How many different agencies worldwide were cooperating together that really did think that there were WMDs in Iraq, and maybe there really were, and Saddam just got them out of Dodge right quick? But I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, if you don't mind. Thank
Okay,
you.
since I was I have some.
Mark, I've got to interrupt and give the boring answer. I didn't do it because I was writing the PhD while it was going on.
All right. All right. I was the vice chairman of the NIC when this was going on. I was actually the person who received the original request for the NIE from the Senate. I was officer commanding CIA that night. Everybody thought there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Everybody. Je répète. Everybody. The French, the Germans, the Russians. The only debate at the UN was what's the best way to get rid of them, not does he or doesn't he have them. So the fact that we wrote this estimate for the president saying we think he has weapons, we are convinced he has weapons of mass destruction, didn't exactly put us in the great minority. There was a vibrant speech by the then French Foreign Minister, de Villepin, who said, of course they're weapons of mass destruction. War is not the answer. So, you know, we all got it wrong. The only difference was that the United States went to war based on that. We did not go to war based on the estimate. That is not true. Thank God we don't write estimates that send people to war. That has much more power than I ever wanted in my life. We went to war for a whole bunch of other reasons. The estimate was not the reason. In fact, all right, here's a data point for you. We wrote this estimate. The Senate received the estimate. 6 members of the Senate, 6, read the estimate. This is an unclassified fact. We made them sign for it. 77 members of the Senate voted to authorize the use of force. So at least 71 of them, if not more, voted to go to war in Iraq having never touched the estimate. So the estimate really had nothing to do with anyone's decision-making. On the other hand, the estimate was wrong. We know that. But everybody thought there was WMD. It was you know what the funny thing is? It's still the best answer to the question. Tonight, it would be the best answer to the question, even though you know it's wrong. There's only 3 answers. He has it, he doesn't have it, we don't know. Okay. You get paid a lot of money not to write, we don't know. It's not an acceptable response. The best answer analytically remains the answer, yes, he has it. It just happens to be wrong, and that's one of the conundrums of doing intelligence.
I want to follow that up with, please remember, it was very important to him that the Iranians believed that he had them.
And that was his mistake.
And that the Shia within Iraq believed he had them, et cetera. And I just want to end on this note. One of the peculiar things about American intelligence is we have this bright, sharp line, the intelligence policy divide, and it causes problems. But as Mark said, the CIA doesn't send people to war. It gives policymakers choices and facts. And as I say, I would really like it to push back harder and make decisions harder but not easier. But when you hear an anecdote like Mark just related about the American Senate, golly, you might begin to ask if some of our problems may not hang on the door of the CIA at all and might have some some relationship to the sort of person who's pathological enough to go into public service today in the United States at times. I know this is being recorded, so I guess I should qualify that with, of course.
You live overseas, it's okay.
We can edit that out if you need us to.
The point is, it takes a special kind of person to stand up and say, yes, I think I'll run for national office today in the United States. And that special kind of person frequently isn't interested in nuance or even arguably facts, much less the T word, truth. They're interested in, their agenda is different, and the CIA and the intelligence community as a whole can't solve that and many other problems for you, but they do a fine job within the constraints of our identity and culture, trying to keep us all safe. So I will end by thanking Mark and anyone else in the room who's in intelligence, and thank you all for coming as well.
Yes, please join me in thanking Dr. Milo Jones and Dr. Mark Lowenthal.